This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Hello everyone and welcome to the first of this year's Modern French History Seminar. Before we start, I just wanted to say welcome to Ludwig Rock, who's just joined the University of Westminster and just joined the organising committee. Also, Andrew is going to be on the committee full time for this year, so he's UCL, Queen Mary, Brunel, so he's got the whole of the London area covered pretty much, and Chichester as well. So I just wanted to say welcome to you two who are joining full time, along with Rob Priest, who's at Royal Holloway. And also welcome to everyone who's come here tonight. I'll hand over to Ian now, who's going to be chairing the session.
Thanks, Alison. Welcome to the first seminar in the series this year at the IHI Modern French History Seminar. I'm very pleased to introduce the first speaker in this year's programme, which is Dr. Noelle Plack. Noelle studied for a PhD at the University of Birmingham. She's held a visiting professorship recently at the École des Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and she's currently a reader in French history at Newman. Noelle's first book was published in 2009. It was called Common Land, Wine and the French Revolution, Rural Society and Economy in Southern France from 1789 to 1820. And she's continuing to pursue her research interest in political economy of consumption, the meaning and forms of tax rebellion, issues of intoxication and social control through her new project, which is going to be exploring the intersection of wine drinking, taxation and rebellion in France, at this time at a longer time period from 1789 right up to 1848. I believe that today's paper is related to this larger project. The title of the talk tonight is Drinking and Rebelling, the Problem of Tax Revolt, Intoxication and Social Control in Revolutionary Paris from 1789 to 1791.
Thank you, Ian. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I hope we kick off your series. It's a great series in good style tonight. Okay, this is part of a larger project about looking at taxation, taxes on wine, rebellion against those taxes, and then issues of intoxication and what does that mean when we mix up wine, taxation, and sort of drinking and intoxication. This paper tonight focuses on revolutionary Paris, and the big revolution of 1789 plays a big part, and then the first 2 years of the revolution. Now, I'm going to start off by telling you a story, and it's going to start with a map of Paris. At 9 a.m. on the 11th of July, 1789, so 3 days before the storming of the Bastille, a man named Jean Cerf was walking into Paris along the Rue Saint-Martin, which is, was that pointer working? Can you see that? Yep. Up here. He's walking up along this road here. Now, as he's walking, he stopped at a customs barrier. And it's not this one. This is the new wall that's being erected around Paris. This section isn't built yet. That only comes into being in 1791. He stopped here, actually, as he's coming into Paris. This is where the Barrière Saint-Martin is, and he's asked by customs officers, all people walking into Paris along this road or any roads that intersect along these customs walls are stopped and asked if he has any goods to declare, any goods that are subject to entry duties. He responds in the negative. The commis, or the customs officials, became suspicious and carried out a search of his person. Now, the customs officials are known as commis in French. During the Ancien Regime and the first 2 years of the Revolution, they were able to search the person of any, the body, the clothes of any person coming into Paris, coming through those customs, those barriers, the barrier gates. Now, this guy, Jean Cerf, on the 11th of July, in the morning, he says, no, I don't have anything. They carry out a search of his person to find that he has 5 bladders filled animal bladders, that is, filled with brandy hidden beneath his clothing. This was not unusual. Women would fill sheep or pigs' bladders, hide them under their skirts, and walk through the customs barriers to not pay these taxes on wine, which I'm going to get into in the paper. So this guy says, no, I don't have anything. They find 5 bladders filled with brandy hidden under his clothing, and they detain and question him. That was around 9 o'clock in the morning. By 11:30, a considerable crowd of people armed with batons, stones, shovels, pitchforks, descended upon the barrier, shouting, "Long live the Third Estate and down with the commis." They were not simply there to liberate Jean Cerf, but swiftly invaded the customs office, destroyed its contents, and set it on fire. During the attack, the commis fled, but they watched as their customs post burned, and they noted that much more brandy was brought into Paris throughout the attack, through this barrier gate, without the payment of entry duties. Those customs guards, their chief function was to stop people and collect taxes on these goods. This assault was not an isolated event, but one of many which occurred in Paris from the 11th to the 14th of July, 1789. Now, the scale of this rebellion, this uprising against indirect taxation, was unprecedented. This recently in construction customs wall, which encircled the capital, so going back to the first slide, this customs wall, this northern section wasn't open yet, but the ones around here, 40 out of the 54 toll gates that were up and running were destroyed, set on fire. Some of them burnt to the ground. And indirect taxes during the Ancien Regime were charged on a range of consumer goods, including meat, tobacco, and wood. But alcohol, wine, beer, cider, brandy, they were of particular importance during these revolts, these first revolts I'm going to talk about, from the 11th to the 14th of July. Alcoholic drinks were of particular importance during these revolts, and they're crucial to understanding them. Not only were people driving cartloads of wine through the barriers tax-free, but slogans and toasts were all infused with wine themes and consumption. Authorities and officials, however, had a very different reaction to these events. They defined them as criminal acts within a year and brought a number of individuals to trial. Yet, in March 1791, after sustained popular protest, the National Assembly abolishes indirect taxation on alcoholic beverages and other consumer goods. When these laws come into effect on the 1st of May, 1791, there were exuberant and intoxicated celebrations along the customs wall. Now, tax revolts, that's a key theme for me, this rebelling. Tax revolts during the French Revolution have not received as much attention from historians as other types of events. Both the anti-seigneurial and counter-revolutionary movements have a very substantial historiography. But as yet, there is little detailed research on tax payments and tax resistance during the 1790s. Perhaps this is because these events do not fit into the classic interpretive frameworks of French revolutionary historiography, because they cannot be described as solely anti-feudal, anti-capitalist, or anti-state. But historians have paid some attention to them. Barry Rose suggested in an article in Past and Present almost 40 years ago that urban and rural refusal to pay taxes was just as important to bringing down the Ancien Regime as subsistence riots and attacks on seigneurial chateaux. There has been much work, however, on French financial history, direct taxation of elites during the 18th century, and the intellectual origins of the progressive tax system. Important as this work is, by scholars such as John Boscher, Catherine Norberg, Michael Quass, and Jean-Pierre Gros, this focus on direct taxation distorts the fact that indirect taxes made up 50% of the Crown's annual revenue in 1788, as opposed to 38% from direct taxation. It also eschews the fact that these taxes on consumer goods, basically VAT taxes, those taxes on consumer goods hit the poor disproportionately hard, as all commodities were assessed at the same rate regardless of quality. Popular action against indirect taxes, which took the form of petition, riot, resistance, and non-compliance, were one of the ways in which ordinary people participated in the new public sphere and actively defined their role in the new nation. Indeed, for many, the ending of indirect taxation was at the heart of the very meaning of the revolution for them. Hence, this paper seeks to provide a rereading of these interconnected series of tax events, which were the largest and most notorious of the French Revolution. So first, the attack on the barriers, the subsequent trial, which took place in Paris at the Cour des Aides, and the court of the wine taxes, basically, and the festivities to mark the abolition of indirect taxation on the 1st of May, 1791. Why have these attacks, criminal trial, and celebration been reduced to a few lines in many historical accounts, if they are indeed mentioned at all? Some historians have argued that the myth of the revolution's early days was created by the well-off men who dominated the revolution in its first few years. The story might have been different if the common people had been setting the agenda instead of the bourgeoisie. This theme of bourgeois officials hijacking and shaping the meaning of events is nothing new, but in the context of tax revolt, and especially revolts against taxes on wine, the presence of popular drinking and intoxication has often been overlooked. Hence, the paper's second main aim is to inject a missing ingredient into the analysis of these events, the role of wine and elite attitudes to popular drinking and drunkenness. So, let me start with this attack on the barriers. This is the Barrière de la Conférence on the 12th of July, 1789. This is in western Paris, right next to the Seine, on the way out to Versailles. And wine was one of the most heavily, large crowds attacked the barrier on the night of the 11th, morning of the 12th, and it's in flames for most of the day on the 12th. This is one of Jean-Louis Prière's engravings of the Tableau de historique de la Révolution française. One of the most heavily taxed goods in France at this time was wine. And it's also the symbolic commodity of choice that served as a spark at many of the barrières in the moments before the violence began. This was not an arbitrary choice, as 18th century Parisian crowds were keenly aware of the political symbolism of their actions, and violent protest was one of the ways in which they attempted to assert their influence in financial matters. At the Barrière Saint-Denis, where we started the story, that's next to the Barrière Saint-Martin in northern Paris, 3 carts loaded with 7 barrels of wine and brandy each were driven through the gates at 7 a.m. on the 13th of July. They were deposited at the door of a wine merchant who swiftly brought them into his house. The historian Bruno Benoit contends that wine often released words or language and pushed people to say or do what they had not dared to. This emancipatory inclination can also be seen in the neighborhood of Courtille, as one of the individuals involved in the attacks was detained and questioned. Etienne Huart, age 30, strongly denied that he had insulted the sergeant of the barrier guards, but did admit that he was pris de vin during the attack. He also denied bringing in wine while the barrier burned, but he did confess to not having enough money to pay for the droit d'entrée, the entry duties levied on all goods coming into Paris. Wine was thus not only a catalyst in many of the attacks, but also a lubricant. Wine is central to understanding these attacks on the barriers because it carried some of the heaviest taxes in terms of value. By the time two of the most prevalent types of indirect taxes on wine were added to a barrel, the price was effectively tripled. So, a mouïd of wine, which is 268, it was an Ancien Régime measurement, basically a big barrel of wine, 268 liters. Ordinary wine, it was probably worth about 30 livres, but the taxes upon that barrel entering Paris through one of those barrier gates would have been 60 livres worth of tax. So that wine that was worth 30 had 60 livres of tax added to it, making a selling price for that barrel of wine 90. So it was very, very highly taxed. I should just add that meat, the other consumer goods that were taxed, not flour, not bread, but the other consumer goods that had indirect taxes, they would never have that, that they would be taxed more than the intrinsic value of the good. Wine was unique in that regard. Now, because these indirect taxes on wine were levied regardless of quality or value, everyday vin commun had a much higher tax burden than better quality vintages. Thus, poor wine consumers essentially subsidized their wealthy counterparts. Taxes on wine and other alcoholic beverages were also some of the most important in terms of value. At the end of the Ancien Régime, the city of Paris collected over 35 million livres in these droits d'entrée, the entry duties. Over 19 million, so 19 of the 35 million, were collected from alcoholic beverages, boissons, which was more than all of the other commodities combined. Now, so we have lots of tax revenue from wine, but there's something else going on. Global consumption of wine was also rising in the 18th century. Wine was consumed more and more. The most prevalent type of alcohol was about 30 livres of wine was drank per year in Paris. Per adult male, I should say. Per adult male, per year, 30 livres of wine. Only 20 livres of beer and 20 liters of beer and 6 liters of cider. So wine, by 1789, had become a daily item in the consumption patterns of many Parisians. According to Colin Jones and Rebecca Spang, they argued for tobacco, sugar, and coffee that it was a luxury item, and it would have been difficult to manage life without it. So coffee, tobacco, sugar, those were luxury items for everyday Parisians. And I'm saying that wine was also in that category. They don't talk about wine in their article, but they're not excluding it. I'm just saying it's also a luxury. It's not a luxury for most Parisians. Most Parisians are drinking it on a daily basis, in addition to going outside the barriers on Sunday and drinking it as well. So it is in this realm of transformed popular expectations that affordably priced wine should be available everywhere in Paris, not just outside the barriers at the Guinguette. Thus, wine becomes the focus of tax revolt in July 1789. Here's another image of a customs barrier. Now they're quite grand buildings. They were recently constructed by the architect Nicolas Ludo, and Parisians did not like them because they were so much money had been spent by the general farm to create this wall, this tax wall, customs wall, and they were attacked again. Another one attacked. This is there's a number of prints showing these buildings on fire. Normally showing the 12th to 13th of July. This is Gobelin, Barrière de la Gobelin. There is a long historical precedent of drinking during tax rebellions. Yves-Marie Berset said that Dutch courage played its part in every outburst of civic rioting. So revolts against taxes on wine were often accompanied by drinking and merrymaking, as casks would be broached and rioters would drink as much tax-free wine as they could. This type of activity clearly took place during some of the attacks on the barrières. At the barrier of Fontainebleau in southeastern corner of Paris, midday on the 13th of July, some 2,000 to 3,000 men and women seized, drank, and carried away all of the wine stored in the customs house. What they could not drink or carry, they broke open and spoiled. So if we can't drink it and carry it away, no one else is either. A similar scene transpired at the Au Vin in central Paris on July 13th. About 11:30 to 2, there was a large group of what the customs officials called brigands, malintentionnés, broke in, drank all of the wine, and ransacked the offices. At the Barrière d'Enfer in western Paris, a crowd on the Rue Saint-Jacques, they were brought in 2 barrels of wine on the 14th of July. I should say something about where I'm getting these stories of these attacks, the attacks. The Archives Nationales holds a series in Z1A, and it's a carton from the trial at the Cour des Aides, and it takes the testimonies of all the barrier guards. What happened at your customs barrier? What happened at your customs barrier? And it outlines the dates, the times. These guards, usually taken on the day of or the next day, give their testimony of what happened. So they're telling what the crowd, their perceptions of the crowd came and what they did. That's where I'm getting these accounts of what happened at these barriers. Now, after the attacks on the barriers, the National Assembly and the Crown were determined to carry out 2 objectives. So the attacks lasted 3 days, from the 11th to the 14th of July. In the summer and the subsequent autumn, they attempted to reimpose the collection of indirect taxes around Paris. Bailly, Lafayette, they were all employed to reestablish those barriers and start the collection of taxes again. People attacked the barriers in the run-up to the Bastille, but the officials in Paris wanted to reinstate those. That was the first sort of objective. The second objective was to arrest, prosecute, and punish those involved in these attacks on the barriers. In the spring of 1790, a diverse group of 4 wine merchants, a livestock feeder, 2 porters, a wheelwright, a plasterer, and 2 women, one a mattress maker and the other a lace maker, were arrested for their role in the attacks on the barriers. They're arrested and put on trial in June 1790, so within a year of the attacks. The trial takes place at the Cour des Aides in Paris, and there is immense pressure from the popular press, Marat, Desmoulins, Herbert. They all write about it in their newspapers around this time, and they say, they've put people on trial in Paris. Go and protest, sort of go to the galleries. And there's immense crowds in the galleries shouting down, watching this trial take place. There's such pressure that the prosecutors from the Cour des Aides, they write to the National Assembly, and one says, I can't deal with this, I don't want to go on. I'm afraid for my life, I'm afraid for what's going to happen. The National Assembly says, let's stop the trial right now, and we're going to debate its relevance. We're going to debate whether it should carry on or not. The debate takes place on the main floor of the National Assembly on the 1st of July, 1790. The trial has only been going about 2 weeks. And this debate contained many elements that were central to the meaning, interpretation, and commemoration of the revolution thus far. And the debate, you can find it in the Archives Parlementaires for the 1st of July, 1790. The fundamental concern of both deputies. There's two kind of opposing viewpoints, and they're spoken by these two deputies. The first is a deputy from the Third Estate called Mungué de Nantou, and he, I'll just change the slide there. During the debate, there's lots of comparison between the Barrières and the Bastille. So how are those two events thought about? How do people interpret them? Are they different? Are they similar? So we have two different rough and ready kind of prints of those two events that took place very close to each other during July. So this deputy from the Third Estate, Mungué de Nantou, he says there's no difference between the events which took place around Paris at the Barrières and the storming of the Bastille. Il a brûlé la barrière, mais de la même main, il a pris la Bastille et assure la liberté. He also demanded, so with one hand he takes, they've burned the Barrières, but with the same hand they've taken the Bastille and secured liberty. He also demanded why those involved with the Parisian attacks should be punished when everywhere in the kingdom the Barrières were attacked. And that is true. I followed up in the summer of 1789. There are instances of communities, smaller market towns, receiving news of these attacks on the Barrières, and the customs officials in their towns are attacked. So they receive news from what happened in Paris, and people say, yeah, we don't want to pay indirect taxes anymore, and they attack the commis in their regions and towns. There's also a concern from members of the Third Estate that the upcoming celebration of the Fête de la Fédération, commemorating the first anniversary of the events in Paris in July, would be marred by this trial and possible conviction of these suspects. So that's one side of the debate. The other side comes from the clergy. This is Abbé Morey. He says that the Barrières and the Bastille were totally different, and warned not to confuse real liberty with those acting under the pretext of liberty for their own personal gain. In this case, tax evasion. Two totally different things. Why were the people who stormed the Bastille described as heroes, and those who attacked the Barrières defined as criminals? Why were some acts defined as revolutionary and some simply riotous? Popular action in the French Revolution challenged elite observers to define an acceptable role for, quote unquote, the people, argues David Andress. Mass crowd action, which took place on the 11th to the 14th of July, proved that the popular classes were capable of producing liberating acts. But how much popular action could be accommodated, and which acts were deemed to be legitimate? Colin Lucas, he's argued that the revolutionaries believed that great moments of crisis produced two sorts of people: citizens and brigands. True citizens armed themselves in defense of liberty. So the people that stormed the Bastille, true citizens. Brigands were only there to take advantage of the situation, the confusion, to loot, to steal, to act for their own personal gains, to evade taxes. Lucas contends that authorities did this so that the revolutionary contribution of the crowd would remain uncontaminated. It would remain pure. That frightening violence which took place from the brigands, that was not part of the revolution's action, revolutionary crowd's actions. Those were in the name of liberty. Now, in the debate in the National Assembly, the deputy from the Third Estate, de Nantou, he refers to the individuals who attacked the Barrières as citoyens. He's trying to convey a sense of liberty for their actions. While certainly not all the deputies agreed with this interpretation of the events, the majority, and certainly the deputies of the Third Estate, moved to declare the trial null and void and passed a motion to drop all charges and free those detained. Now, that's exactly what happened. They stopped the trial and they let go all of those people that had been arrested. The tension, thus, between liberty and license and the shaping and defining of these events began the very moment the revolution did and continued in the following months and years. Questions around who had the authority to define such events and their meaning were contested not only within the National Assembly, but among the popular classes as well. Their interactions formed the core of the revolutionary process. And not only me, but other historians, Peter McPhee, most notably, has argued this process, this revolutionary process, was one of negotiation and confrontation. And a key, or an example that I like to use that illustrates this, is this continued rebellion, continued protest against these indirect taxes in the early years of the French Revolution. Throughout the rest of 1789, 1790, there is continued protest, physical, violent protest against the customs barriers, the customs guards, but also you get a new sense of people writing petitions to the National Assembly saying, we don't want to pay these taxes anymore, they're unfair. So you have both violent and non-violent protests. The National Assembly, they're in two minds. They kind of want to keep these taxes because, the finances are going down the tubes. They need to keep the tax base up. They need to keep collecting taxation. But taxation was one of the things that kind of started the French Revolution. And indirect taxes, they were easier to collect in a way because you could collect them on goods coming into a city or town. Certainly easier to assess without a land register, which didn't happen until Napoleon gets the cadastre up and running in the early part of the 19th century. The National Assembly, though, is forced by this continued popular uprising, protest, to abolish all indirect taxes on consumer goods in February and March of 1791. I should say that there were a lot of physiocrats in the National Assembly, and they really believed that they could solve the nation's financial troubles by assessing just one unique land tax on everyone. The physiocrats really believed that they could get all France's revenue needs from one land tax. And that was their dream, but it was never going to prove adequate. It was never going to prove sufficient enough a tax base that balanced taxation between indirect and direct taxes is the way a healthy sort of tax system is constructed and run. But the National Assembly, they do abolish all these taxes, and for about 9 years, 10 years, France does not have any taxation on consumer goods. Napoleon brings them back in 1801 and again in 1804. But for about 10 years in the 1790s, there's no taxation on consumer goods. When this law comes into effect on the 1st of May, 1791, there are prolonged, exuberant, lively celebrations along that now redundant customs wall in Paris and in larger cities and towns across France, because those also customs walls are now no longer in use. This is the Barrière des Champs-Élysées, and you can see here, there used to be customs guards at all these little outposts and gates that would line this. The gates are now gone, and you probably can't see too well, but there's people up here destroying this wall. And what's coming through are immense amounts of goods that used to be subject to taxation. So lots of wine coming through, people opening it up, drinking it right on the spot, more wine on a cart. And of course, the cattle coming through, because those were also, cattle, beef was also something that was taxed. Chickens, poultry, other goods, fish as well, were taxed. So things coming in that were now untaxed, free. People dancing, people celebrating. Carts filled with barrels of wine and other goods lined up. They actually lined up on the roads outside of Paris in the days before, April 28th, 29th, 30th. They lined up for the stroke of midnight on April 30th, 1791. And the gates were opened and all these goods came in, and it was a major, major party. Waiting for that stroke of midnight to pass through these customs barriers free of charge. In the many accounts of these celebrations, several things stand out. First of all, wine was the center of the festivities, and drinking was a social and communal act. And I think even from this image here, you can see that wine drinking, toasting, commemorating newly found liberties. Indeed, to discuss wine in the revolutionary context is to speak about equality, democratization, and the abolition of privileges. Humble people now had the same pleasures and the same rights as the rich. They could drink wine tax-free. The rich really weren't bothered by these taxes. A lot of them had exemptions. They had privileges. They didn't have to, like a bourgeois could bring in wine that he produced on his own land into Paris, pay no tax on it. So this constant refrain of privilege, big in the petitions and in the revolts as well. So this abolition of privileges and the abolition of taxes on wine, people were really, really pleased. But behind these very public celebrations, officials privately expressed some very serious concerns about these events. In his letters, the mayor of Paris, Bailly, he orders extra troops on this day and the days before, 30th of April, 1st of May, the 2nd of May. He wants the troops to protect these customs walls, or the customs houses, the gates that they were taken off in the few days before, or the few days after, sorry, and they they're iron, so they want to protect them. Those are, quite expensive during that point. The government wants to retain them, melt them, sell them on. However, intoxication was also another pressing anxiety for officials in the days prior to the festivities. This is another image of that day. This is the Barrière d'Enfer. Another barrier, the gate is gone. People are coming in, someone right in the middle there with a bottle and a glass. Barrels over here coming in, celebrating. She's holding a branch of a tree there, and I'm assuming that's a symbol of a liberty tree. Now, intoxication. Bailly was very aware that the celebrations would fall on a Sunday. The 1st of May, 1791 was a Sunday, a day of inaction for workers. A day, traditionally, when they would go outside these barriers to the guinguette, drink, dance, and in Bailly's words, cause formidable disorder. There was much apprehension that people would use the celebrations on the 1st of May to get drunk and wreak havoc. Bailly warned that manual workers, they would stop the first cartloads of wine coming in on the 30th, or the midnight of 30th of April, and drink all night in the guise of celebrating, with the pretext of celebrating. This is again illustrative of elite attitudes to popular actions in the French Revolution. There were two types of people, according to Bailly: citizens who were there to celebrate legitimately, and malicious people who would use the opportunity to cause trouble. However, because of the role of alcohol, there is another set of underlying assumptions that must be factored into this equation. Now, throughout the early modern period, there have always been tensions surrounding public drinking and drunkenness. For centuries, the church had defined drunkenness as a mortal sin, but in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, moralists, medical practitioners, economic theorists, and judicial officials began publishing tracts denouncing excessive drinking. Analyzing drunkenness in the past raises a number of methodological challenges. First is the problem of quantification. How much were people drinking and what implications did it have? Now, consumption rates. How much people were consuming? I said 300 liters per year per adult male. Even if they didn't drink all that at once, it could have been over a liter a day. Sometimes people most likely became intoxicated. But how do we separate the real effects, quote unquote, of intoxication from the discourse and anxiety that surrounds drunkenness? This is especially true as the church, government officials, and the elite, they held certain views surrounding alcohol consumption, while the common people held other views surrounding alcohol consumption and intoxication. Both popular actors and authorities use the effects of wine drinking to explain behavior. Now, the traditional view of popular drinking was one of excess. This is Ramponneau's tavern in 18th century Paris, a very famous engraving or print of what happened in this. This was one of the biggest taverns in Paris on the outskirts, so it was on the other side of the barriers, and people would go there, most notably on a Sunday, but at all times of the day and week, and drink, because the wine was much cheaper out there. And you can see the effects of drinking. Some people here around a table. This guy is having a little trouble keeping his balance. This person over here is slumped over. He might have had a little too much. This person has definitely had too much here with the dog coming in. Music, merrymaking. Traditional view of popular drinking is one of excess. People drank a lot, especially on Sundays. Too much, became drunk, became they became dangerous. There are a multitude of sources which describes the overindulgence of the common people and the social ills that this could cause. In his Dictionnaire philosophique, Voltaire suggested that the numerous feast days were probably invented by the tavern owners, and complained that these days of idleness and debauchery are precisely the time when all the crimes get committed. So the link between drunkenness and criminal behavior. Disapproval, fear, disgust were prevalent in contemporary descriptions. And I quote here from Mercier, Louis-Sébastien Mercier, "Taverns are the cause of drunkenness, theft, debauchery, and idleness. Cafes are the refuge of the idle, and I love this, the asylum of the indigent." Cafes are the asylum of the indigent. So lots of elite sort of disapproval of popular drinking. But changing patterns of consumption can also be seen in the elite discourse around drunkenness. Georges Durand, a historian that studied Lyonnais and Beaujolais in the early modern period, he argues that the official literature on drunkenness reveals a rage amongst the popular classes at seeing their social distinctions diminish as the popular orders consumed more and more wine. Now, the elite wished that they could distinguish themselves from the poor by the type of wine they drank, of course, but also by the amount that they drank. They hoped that the poor would remain excluded from wine consumption as a sign of their inferior condition. However, However, there is another reading of all these disapproving, disdainful, and patronizing texts. Although there was clearly a strong religious, judicial, moralist, medical, and socioeconomic rhetoric against drunkenness throughout the early modern period, Mathieu Lecoutre, a young French historian, has recently argued that real repression was simply an illusion. Ivresse, drunkenness, intoxication, that wonderful feeling, repression of that was an illusion. Ivresse was fundamental to French sociability, identity. The state and others took far too much revenue from taxation to seriously crack down on drunkenness. He argues that, real repression, if they really wanted to crack down on drunkenness, they didn't because of all of the revenue. For example, the associated taxes on alcohol had a net value of just over 50 million livres, some 10% of the total annual revenue of the crown. So 10% of the crown's revenue is coming from taxes on alcohol. There's no way they could crack down on drunkenness and public sort of intoxication. For all of this negative rhetorical discourse, then, there were real limits to actual repression. However, if there was social unrest or public order was breached, this tacit toleration of public drunkenness or popular people drinking, the toleration would be rescinded if there was social unrest and public disorder. The police and judicial authorities would take action if there was trouble, basically. And this final point about the context of intoxication is fundamental to explaining the official reactions to popular drinking in the French Revolution. Oh, excuse me, I'm almost done. Anxieties around, this is Les Sœurs, obviously Repas Républicains, from a little later, 1792. Good Republican meal, people celebrating, the newly founded Republic, and wine, and that toast to the Republic is central, red wine, to it. Anxieties around intoxication clearly played a role in how how authorities reacted to and defined both these initial attacks on the barriers of July 1789 and the celebrations on the 1st of May 1791. Tax revolts were certainly about transgressing the authority of the crown, but there was also something about the loss of social control, as wine figured so prominently in the events and discourse. There is also the question of whether it was illegal to rebel against a tax regime that was considered unjust. The illegitimate nature of the taxes and the legality, quote unquote, of the attacks were certainly sanctioned by the National Assembly in July 1790 and February 1791, when it declared the trial of those arrested null and void and abolished the droit d'entrée. The festivities held on the 1st of May were in many ways a political act of commemoration over which authorities needed to assert their control. Thus, Bailly's anxiety over the potential drunkenness reflected elite attitudes for a variety of reasons. Not only did he reinforce the idea that idle working men would be drinking and possibly causing trouble, he was linking alcohol and its consumption to how authorities viewed popular actions during key episodes in the French Revolution. In both the attacks on the barriers and the 1st of May celebrations, apprehension over intoxication played a role in who was defined as a brigand or a malintentioné and who was defined as a citizen. Citizens might consume wine, but they would certainly not become drunk, as this constituted a dangerous condition which would threaten the peace, order, and stability of the new nation. Now, in many ways, the French Revolution can be interpreted as a victory for popular drinking, as less expensive wine was a key achievement. Without a doubt, there were older traditions of sociability and communal drinking still prevalent in revolutionary Paris, but they were now infused with a new rhetoric of liberty. Indeed, the fight to abolish indirect taxes was a direct result of the compromise and negotiation between popular and elite actors in making the French Revolution. This brief abolition of taxes on alcohol changed French drinkers and how they thought about the espoused ideals of liberty and equality. And by articulating their demands in terms of consumption, political actors insisted that liberty and equality be made material, physical, and substantive. Wine was an ever-present symbol in the revolution, first as a sign of revolt, then as a symbol of newly found liberties. However, when it was perceived to cause intoxication, it was a problematic object that brought to the fore tensions and anxieties over the very meaning of the revolution itself and who constituted the citizenry of the new nation. This complex and multifaceted history is indicative of the socioeconomic and political challenges that alcohol and its consumption have always posed. It is time for historians of the French Revolution to confront the role that wine, drinking, and drunkenness played within it. Thank you.